Something seismic just happened. A move so bold, so sudden, it caught Washington completely off guard. Beijing didn't just throw a wrench into America's chip dominance. It drove a wedge straight to the heart of U.S. technological leverage. Without warning, China issued a sweeping directive to all domestic companies. Immediately halt the purchase of American-made semiconductors. No exceptions. No appeals. Overnight, the once reliable artery funneling billions of dollars in U.S. chips into China's vast technology ecosystem froze. Cold. And this isn't posturing. The fallout is already taking shape. Inside the White House and across Capitol Hill, alarm bells are ringing. At the center of this unfolding crisis is U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, a billionaire-turned-public servant, once hailed as a Wall Street market whisperer. Now, he's grappling with a global firestorm that could dismantle decades of American tech and trade policy in just a matter of months. So what triggered the backlash? From Washington's perspective, it was a clever maneuver. After years of steadily tightening restrictions on China's access to advanced processors, Donald Trump had just signed off on what insiders called a loophole chip. NVIDIA's H20, a GPU specifically designed to be just weak enough to comply with U.S. export controls, but still powerful enough to satisfy the needs of Chinese AI firms. The thinking was cold and calculated. Sell the chips. Tax the exports at 15%. Let the U.S. Treasury pocket billions. Keep NVIDIA's most lucrative customer happy. Maintain Chinese dependence. A win-win-win, or so it seemed. But Beijing didn't just say no deal. It said never again. Chinese officials immediately canceled all H20 orders. Then they took it further, issuing a blanket ban on all semiconductor purchases from major U.S. chip makers, including NVIDIA and AMD, crippling two of America's most valuable tech giants in one decisive stroke. And it didn't stop there. Next came new government regulations forbidding any U.S.-made chips from being used in state-funded technology projects. A red line had been drawn, and Washington was now on the wrong side of it. This wasn't about performance specs. This wasn't about chip quality. This was about dignity, about sovereignty, and most of all, about independence. Beijing is sending a clear and forceful message to the world. China will no longer be held hostage by American technology. What U.S. policymakers once touted as a strategic win has now become a very public and very expensive humiliation. And the ramifications stretch far beyond one chip or one sector. This marks a turning point in the global balance of technological power. Let's be honest, this didn't happen overnight. For over a decade, Washington pursued a long-term, bipartisan strategy aimed at suppressing China's semiconductor ambitions. The rules were simple and consistent across administrations, Democrat and Republican alike. Restrict access to high-end chips. Deny exports of essential design software. Ban sales of advanced lithography tools. Block Chinese firms from acquiring critical infrastructure. The goal was to slow China down, to delay, disrupt, and deny. But while America built walls, China laid foundations. Hundreds of billions of yuan were poured into the domestic semiconductor sector. Entire industrial cities were constructed around fabs and foundries. Chinese universities ramped up STEM programs focused on materials science, nanoengineering, and photonics. For China, chip independence wasn't just a business goal. It was a national survival imperative. Yes, the early results were uneven. There were failures and false starts. But there was also momentum. And over time, it became clear China was closing the gap faster than Washington ever anticipated. By the time Trump's full-scale trade war began, with tariffs, sanctions, and blacklists, the fuse had already been lit. The U.S. expected pressure to force China into submission. Instead, it sparked a national acceleration. What began as a strategy of decoupling quickly turned into a race for innovation. And in many areas, China is now pulling ahead. Entire Chinese supply chains have been restructured to eliminate reliance on U.S. components. New startups are flourishing with state backing. And domestic powerhouses like Huawei and SMIC are producing increasingly sophisticated chips using homegrown architectures. Beijing has shown not only that it can maneuver around sanctions, but that it can endure them. By 2023, it became clear to U.S. officials. The pressure campaign was boomeranging. America's own tech giants, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, Intel, were bleeding revenue. Their largest and most profitable customer had been locked out. China wasn't just a key buyer. It was the biggest and most lucrative. Losing that market wasn't just a temporary setback. It was an existential threat to long-term earnings. So Washington pivoted. Enter the H-20, a chip just hobbled enough to meet export rules, wrapped in export taxes to provide political cover. The idea? Give China a taste, just enough to keep it hooked, while preserving control. But Beijing saw the game for what it was. And this time, it refused to play. China didn't take the bait. Why? Because by then, the landscape had already shifted. Beijing had successfully rolled out AI systems like DeepSeek, trained and deployed entirely on Chinese hardware. And they worked. The long-held belief that China needed U.S. GPUs to build world-class AI was shattered. That's when the calculus changed. From Beijing's perspective, the H-20 wasn't a compromise. It was an insult, a deliberately weakened product, sold at a premium with a Washington-imposed tax baked into every unit. The message was clear. Here's your tech, but only on our terms. Beijing's response? No thanks. And it wasn't quiet. It was loud, deliberate, and unmistakably public. Chinese firms were instructed to cancel orders for American chips across the board and to chart a new course, one built on domestic or allied alternatives. The world was meant to witness it, because this wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a declaration, a signal that the unipolar tech era, shaped and led by the U.S., is over, that China no longer intends to operate within the architecture of American economic dominance. And the fallout is just beginning. Take Apple. In 2023, nearly 1 in 5 of its global dollars came from China. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. China is where Apple's supply chain breathes, from component sourcing to factory assembly, to the finely tuned logistics that enable global releases. If Beijing cracks down, Apple suffers a double blow: lost customers and disrupted operations. NVIDIA's exposure runs even deeper. Chinese companies once bought entire shipments of GPUs for AI and data centers. Without that market, NVIDIA stands to lose tens of billions over the coming years. The AI boom in the U.S. was, in part, fed by those Chinese sales. Without them, growth stagnates. Qualcomm? In 2023, 64% of its total revenue came from China. And it wasn't just Chinese phones. Many smartphones powered by Qualcomm chips were built in China and sold globally. Pull that thread and Qualcomm's entire global strategy starts to unravel. This isn't theoretical. It's financial reality. And every day those chip orders remain frozen, another $1 billion in revenue disappears. Scott Bassan understands this. Insider say he's pressing the administration to recalibrate, to open back channel talks, to find an off-ramp. But here's the problem. This isn't just about sales anymore. It's about trust. And once trust is broken, it doesn't return easily. Even if a short-term deal is patched together, the long-term trend is already in motion. China is moving away from American technology, and the world is watching closely. Because if China can prove it's capable of running advanced systems, powering AI, and building digital infrastructure without U.S. chips, other countries will start asking, if they can do it, why can't we? That's the most dangerous outcome of all. Not just the loss of revenue, but the loss of influence. For decades, America's technological edge shaped global standards, licensing regimes, encryption protocols, platform dominance. But if China succeeds in building a parallel system, one that's robust, scalable, and untethered, the U.S. won't just lose sales. It will lose control. The narrative will flip. Washington will no longer be the gatekeeper of global technology, just one option among many. And while that shift might seem subtle now, it could redefine the global economy for decades to come. America's superpower status has always rested on more than military might. It has been built on the ability to set the terms of commerce, of innovation, of the digital future. And at the core of that power, semiconductors. Now, for the first time in modern history, another nation is challenging that foundation directly, not through rhetoric, but through decisive action. So here we are, The U.S. is staring down the possibility of an irreversible shift in the global tech order, not triggered by war or diplomacy, but by a quiet, bureaucratic directive from Beijing. No threats, no shots fired, just a single sentence that may change the future. Stop buying American chips.